When a relationship ends, especially if she was the one who walked away, the first thing that usually takes over isn't sadness, it's justification. She needs to believe she made the right decision. That's the first wall that comes up, not because she's cold or heartless, but because admitting that she might have lost something valuable is too painful to face so soon. So her mind becomes a courtroom. She starts gathering evidence, building a case against the relationship. She'll focus on all the things you didn't do, all the times she felt unseen, or moments you failed to meet her expectations. And even if those things were small, they become massive in her mind because the ego is trying to protect her from regret. See, she doesn't sit there and say, I miss him, even if deep down she does. That would mean confronting vulnerability. And most people, especially when emotions are raw, can't handle that level of exposure. So instead of admitting that her heart still cares, she convinces herself that walking away was empowerment. She reframes the breakup as growth. She tells herself that she finally found her worth, that she was settling before, and that losing you was actually finding her. These thoughts aren't always lies, but they're not always the full truth either. They're a protective narrative, one that allows her to feel safe, strong, and in control. And during this stage, you'll notice a coldness in her that didn't exist before. She might seem happier, more active online. Maybe she's posting things that sound like indirect jabs. That's not confidence, it's camouflage. What you're seeing is not a healed woman, but a defensive one. Her mind is working overtime to silence the emotional noise beneath the surface. She's trying to prove to herself and maybe to the world that she's unaffected, when in reality she's just suppressing what she's not yet ready to face. Now here's the part most men misunderstand. When she talks badly about you to friends or paints herself as the victim, it's not always to destroy your reputation. Sometimes it's to make the story easier to live with. If she can convince others that you were the problem, it becomes easier to silence the internal voice that says you let go of something real. That's why, in the beginning, you won't see the full weight of her feelings, because she hasn't felt them yet. She's too busy justifying. But justification is only the first phase. It doesn't last forever, and when it starts to crack, when the silence gets deeper and the memories grow louder, that's when the real truth begins to surface. But by then, your silence might already be saying everything she thought she'd never hear. Silence doesn't just echo, it confronts. At first, she might interpret your silence as confirmation. Confirmation that you've moved on, that you never cared, that you're doing just fine without her. And for someone trying to prove to herself that she made the right decision, that silence becomes incredibly uncomfortable because it doesn't give her anything to react to. It doesn't validate the story she's built, and that's where the dissonance begins. You see, people expect drama after a breakup. They expect a reaction, some kind of chase, some pleading, or an emotional outburst, because that makes things easier to define. If you break, if you beg, then she feels justified. She can point to your desperation and say, see, he's weak, or he still wants me. I have the power. But when there's nothing, no text, no call, not even a passive post on social media, that narrative begins to fall apart. Silence is unsettling because it forces her to sit with her own thoughts without distraction. And it's not the silence itself that drives her crazy. It's what the silence might mean. Is he really gone? Has he accepted it already? Was I wrong to believe he needed me more than I needed him? Those thoughts start crawling in, slowly at first, then all at once. Because silence isn't passive, it's a powerful form of communication. It tells her you have nothing left to prove, that you've reclaimed your dignity, and deep down that begins to chip away at her own confidence. She might start testing the waters subtly, a random like on your story, a reaction to something you post, maybe a vague message that could mean anything. But here's the thing, she's not just reaching out for connection. She's reaching out for reassurance that she still matters. She wants to know she hasn't completely lost your attention. Because if you still care, then she's not the one who got left behind. But if you stay silent, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, she'll start feeling the discomfort she tried so hard to avoid. And that discomfort can be transformative. It makes her revisit the decisions she made in anger or pride. It forces her to question whether she gave up something meaningful too quickly. That silence begins to speak louder than any argument or confrontation ever could. It doesn't just say, I'm done. It says, I respect myself enough not to chase what doesn't value me. That's when the tables start to turn. Not because you played a game, but because you honored your own worth. It starts in subtle ways. She begins comparing the connection you two shared with whatever interactions she's having now. Maybe she's gone on a few dates or tried to fill the emotional space with distractions, friends, attention, validation from others. But there's a problem with that. It's all surface level. It doesn't touch the depth of what you brought to the table. And that realization doesn't hit all at once. It creeps in during quiet moments when the crowd is gone and she's left with her thoughts. What she used to overlook in you, your consistency, your depth, your emotional presence, now starts to stand out in contrast to the fleeting or shallow attention she's receiving elsewhere. At first, she might convince herself that the excitement of something new will replace what you had. But new doesn't always mean better. And emotional intimacy, once experienced, is difficult to forget. It leaves a mark. You showed her a version of connection that wasn't about games or short-term validation. It was rooted in sincerity, in effort, in presence. And that's not easily replicated. And here's where it starts to sting. The more she tries to find a replacement, the more she realizes how rare that kind of energy is. You weren't just another guy. You were someone who showed up fully. Someone who understood her patterns, who paid attention to the details, who didn't run when things got hard. And maybe at the time she didn't value it. Maybe she assumed you'd always be there, that you'd keep showing up even when she started pulling away. But when that stopped, when your presence became absence, she noticed. Not just the lack of attention, but the lack of meaning in the attention she now receives. She starts to understand the difference between being seen and just being looked at, between being heard and simply being responded to. That gap between what she had with you and what she's experiencing now becomes louder each day. And when a woman starts realizing that the attention she's chasing isn't fulfilling, she doesn't just feel lonely, she feels regret. Regret for misjudging, for underestimating the value of what she walked away from. And that regret begins to look a lot like longing. That's when everything starts to shift for her. Because it's no longer about the fight you had or the breakup itself. It's about the emotional space you once held in her life and the fact that no one has been able to occupy it the same way since. And that's not something she can escape from, no matter how far she runs or how many new people she surrounds herself with. When that realization hits, it doesn't just hurt, it awakens something deeper than pride or ego ever could. She might act like she's over it. She might laugh a little louder, post more confidently, maybe even seem happier than ever. But there's something that always gives it away. The emotional impulsiveness. It doesn't come from strength, it comes from conflict. She starts behaving in ways that don't match her words. One day she's posting about freedom and peace, and the next she's dropping cryptic messages that clearly reflect inner tension. That inconsistency, it's not by accident. It's what happens when the mask of indifference starts slipping and real emotion begins to surface. She wants to appear detached, unaffected, maybe even victorious, like she's moved on without missing a beat. But underneath the surface, there's a storm building. You start to see her react to things in ways that don't quite make sense unless you understand what's really going on. That impulsive behavior, it's a reflection of emotional imbalance. And it shows up when she realizes the emotional distance she created has now become her reality. She wanted space, but she didn't expect silence. She expected you to chase. When that didn't happen, her mind began to race with doubts, and that's where the impulsivity kicks in. You see it when she tries to provoke a reaction, whether through attention-seeking posts, reaching out indirectly, or suddenly trying to show that she's doing better without you. But if you look closely, all of it is reactive, not proactive. It's not confidence, it's compensation. She's trying to regain control over a situation that feels like it's slipping further away. The attention she's getting now doesn't feel the same. It's not rooted in history or understanding. It's surface level, and when she realizes it doesn't satisfy her deeper emotional needs, frustration turns into erratic behavior. Now, that doesn't mean she's falling apart publicly. No, she might still look composed to the outside world, but emotional impulsiveness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the small, uncharacteristic choices. It's suddenly reaching out to someone from the past. It's cutting off friends without warning. It's overcommitting to distractions or jumping headfirst into new connections just to numb the absence. These are all signs that she's emotionally unsettled, that the detachment she tried to manufacture isn't sustainable. And what's even more telling is how often she loops back to the past, not necessarily by mentioning you, but by behaving in ways that circle back to the emotional connection you two shared. Her actions betray the reality. She hasn't moved on as much as she wants to believe. She's just reacting to the emptiness that's followed your absence. And when that emptiness becomes louder than the pride keeping her from reaching out, that's when the facade truly starts to crack. There's something remarkably revealing in how she begins to romanticize the connection she once had with you. At first, she might deny it. She may say she's over it, claim that she's finally free, maybe even pretend that the relationship was holding her back. But over time, especially in moments of stillness, she starts to remember not the conflicts or the frustrations, but the emotional safety, the consistency, the little things that formed the backbone of her emotional security. And that's when nostalgia creeps in, quietly but powerfully. It's subtle at first. Maybe she hears a song that used to play when you two were together, and it lingers in her mind longer than it should. Maybe she walks by a place you once visited and pauses without knowing why. Those moments begin to accumulate, and what they do is reconstruct the memory of what you were, not in the distorted, conflict-heavy way she might have leaned on to justify her distance, but in the pure, vulnerable truth of how she actually felt. She starts to see the connection in a new light, one that softens her defenses and brings back emotional clarity. Now, this isn't always something she expresses outwardly. Often it plays out internally, in the quiet space where pride can't shout over truth. The mind has a way of filtering the past when the present feels empty. She starts remembering how it felt to be understood, how deeply she could be herself around you, how your presence brought calm where the world often brought chaos. And that comparison between then and now becomes a source of tension. You see, most people don't really miss a person, they miss how they felt when they were with that person. And when the people she surrounds herself with now don't bring her that same depth, when the conversations feel shallow and the connections lack substance, that's when she starts to feel the absence of what she once took for granted. It's not about missing your presence at every moment, it's about missing who she was when you were present. That's the kind of emotional truth that starts to soften even the most stubborn walls. Eventually, that romanticizing leads her to test the waters. Maybe she starts asking mutual friends how you're doing. Maybe she lingers on your social media profile a little longer. Maybe she drops hints through posts or indirect messages. It's not always a direct move because the ego still stands in the way, but emotionally, she's already halfway back. Not because she wants to lose again, but because what she walked away from feels more valuable now than it did when she had it. And when she reaches that point where memory starts to outweigh resentment, where nostalgia overpowers pride, that's when something shifts. That's when the emotional walls she built to keep you out begin to turn into windows that let all the feelings flood back in. What truly begins to haunt her is the silence, especially when it lasts longer than she expected. At first, she might have mistaken your absence for a temporary tactic, something you'd snap out of. Maybe she believed you were just trying to get a reaction, to test her emotions, to see if she still cared. But as the days stretch into weeks, and those weeks begin to reshape her reality, she realizes something deeper is unfolding, something she didn't prepare for. That silence, that space, that lack of contact, it starts to echo. Not just in her environment, but in her mind. She checks her phone more than she wants to admit. She scrolls through her old messages, wondering if she missed a cue, if maybe she read you wrong. She notices that you're not watching her stories anymore, that your name no longer shows up where it used to. That ghost of attention she had grown so used to disappears. And that's when uncertainty kicks in. She doesn't know what you're thinking anymore. She's not sure if you've moved on. And that uncertainty, the not knowing, starts to create a quiet chaos inside her. People often assume that distance alone will spark regret. But it's not the distance, it's what fills that distance. If you were begging for her back, if you were posting emotional signals to get her attention, she'd still feel like she has control. But when you go quiet, genuinely quiet, without bitterness, without games, without noise, that unnerves her more than anything else. Because now she has no way to gauge what you feel, no way to be sure if she still matters. And that lack of certainty breeds a kind of anxiety she can't explain to anyone else. When someone is used to your presence, even subtly, they build a world with your energy in it. You're part of their emotional routine, even if they pretend otherwise. And when that energy vanishes, the vacuum it leaves becomes unavoidable. Suddenly, the attention she took for granted is gone. The validation she once quietly absorbed is no longer there to hold her sense of self. And it begins to eat at her, slowly, consistently. She may still pretend to be fine. She might still post as if everything is perfect, still smile in photos, still live her life on the surface. But under that curated image, there's unrest, because the one thing she was sure of, you still being there in some way, is no longer certain. And that's what drives her insane. It's not heartbreak, it's not loneliness, it's the realization that she may have let go of something stable, and now she's not the one in control of how or whether it ever comes back. Sometimes the most powerful message you can send is your absence.